We are a rather unusual species, you know. And one of the ways in which we engage the world is in terms of opposites. You know, we think black, white, we think wet, cold, wet, hot, wet, dry, hot, cold. We think of us and other. That's where we come into a rather interesting and problematic aspect of the way in which we think in opposites, ourselves and others. We think in terms of othering as opposed to embracing. And both as Americans and as humans, we have tendencies to do both. We can otherize and we can embrace. When we're at our best as humans and as Americans, we embrace. When we are less, we tend to otherize. This evening is, as you have heard, of course, about the ideas of restoration, of reconciliation, of resiliency, in a context in which, in particular ways, we have been particularly oppressed over the last couple of years, both humanity and the United States. As humanity has tried over the course of millennia and over the course of the last couple of years, and more recently than that, to move forward, so of course America has. And one of the obvious ways in which American resiliency has shown itself is with the extraordinary speed with which vaccinations against COVID were produced at a pace infinitely quicker than is usually the case for the production of such vaccinations. So among other things, it's a rather extraordinary symptom and symbol of our resiliency as Americans, and as that productivity has spread across the planet as humans. And of course, we're only starting to move forward. We still have much further to go. If we didn't, we'd all be in Austin and we wouldn't be talking by way of a screen. Yesterday, as Gunnar pointed out, was June 19th. This whole weekend has been rather interesting. Juneteenth, a specifically American feature of history in which the issues of restoration, reconciliation, resilience are important because it marks the anniversary of the ending of slavery in North America over a century and a half ago. The declaration of June 19th as a federal holiday was made 2 days earlier by President Biden on June 17th. And the whole conversation that revolves around that should and does remind us of a second form of oppression from which we have needed to become resilient and reconciled. If one has been COVID, another has been the issue of othering with respect to race, with respect to religion. So June 19th is not just marking the anniversary of the end of an institution, it's a reminder that aspects of what underlay that institution are still in operation in too many parts of our country and too many parts of the world. And that it's not just about othering by way of race, it's othering by way of religion. It's othering in all kinds of ways, by way of nation. But I like race, religion, because with restoration, reconciliation, and resiliency, I'm building up a supply of R's. Why not? And we are still trying to move forward. I would add another R, both to this conversation in general and to the sense of complication with respect to othering versus weing, embracing versus othering, and that is refugees. So another R, we can call it the fourth R after restoration, reconciliation, and resiliency. Or if you prefer, I'll leave the mathematics up to you. You can call it the sixth R, including restoration, reconciliation, resiliency, race, religion, and refugees. And of course, today is International Refugee Day. So yesterday was June 19th, today, June 20th, is International Refugee Day, in which we take note of the extraordinary array of refugee populations, both past and present. And that's the thing, it's not just past, it's present. It's not just present, it's past. On June 17th, I said a moment ago, President Biden declared June 19th, Juneteenth, as a federal holiday. June 17th also marked the anniversary of the time in 1939 when the ship known as the St. Louis, having sailed from Europe with 960 refugees upon it, most of them Jews, with entry permits with visas to enter Cuba by way of Havana, were, when they got there, turned away on the grounds that for some reason the visas, for which they paid well, no longer applied. And so the German captain, desperate to help the 960 refugees on his ship, of course, as many of you probably are aware, sailed up the coast of the United States, stopping at every coastal city, at every harbor, up to Canada, the same, turned away, turned away, turned away. We turned our back on those refugees then. It's a pattern that sometimes we have diverged from and embraced refugees, and all too often, including in the last couple of years, we have turned to rejecting and turning our backs on refugees. In fact, one of the things that most annoys me personally, you are aware of language, and you may be aware of the fact that in the last several years, the word refugee has disappeared from our vocabulary. Politicians, the press, the pundits use instead the word migrant. And as you are no doubt aware, the word migrant in English has a different connotation from that of refugee. Refugee tends to imply someone whom we might and ought and should feel obligated to help, to bring in, to embrace. It's easier, perhaps, to turn your back on someone who is labeled a migrant because your assumption is, oh, a migrant, someone coming here to get work and then is going to turn around and go home. He doesn't have to get his work here. She doesn't have to get her work here. Refugee, different category. So we have relabeled refugees again and again as migrants. So we have conquered, or we're in the process of conquering, a disease that is unprecedented in its scope in the course of this last century. We have been resilient as Americans and as humans in finding the means to combat diseases from polio to COVID. Can we conquer our prejudices the same way we have conquered diseases? Can we conquer our smaller, more selfish inclinations in favor of our more generous, our more mutually focused inclinations? Can we conquer our inclination to other in favor of an inclination to embrace? Well, one of the directions across human history which has offered a kind of guidance to how one might feel and think about embracing rather than othering is paradoxically religion, that very element which becomes, across history and geography all too often, including recently, including in the United States, a means of othering. Religion in particular, in its intensified subset known as mysticism, can be not about othering but embracing, not about particularizing and about thinking selfishly, but about universalizing and thinking more broadly and generously. The mystic is someone who desires to be filled with God. By definition, that's what a mystic seeks. In order to be filled with God, the mystic has to empty him or herself of self to make room for God. And if I empty myself of self and fill myself with God, I'm likely to realize that whatever particularized sense of religious favoritism I might have possessed was not God speaking, but my own ego speaking, my own selfish self speaking. So the mystic's goal is to be filled with God, but not just to be filled with God, not just to gain enlightenment, because think about this. That would be too selfish. If I want enlightenment, that's all about me. It's not about wanting to be enlightened. It's not about wanting to be filled with God. It's about wanting to be filled with God and enlightened so that under that changed condition that I will have experienced, I can benefit the community around me. I can benefit the world around me, ideally. I can help others. So we find this inclination again and again in Jewish and Christian and Muslim mysticism. You have it in characters like St. Francis of Assisi and his famous dialogue with the Sultan of Egypt. You have it in Abraham Abulafia in Spain, who is teaching Kabbalah to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, males and females alike. You find it in Muslim mysticism with Ibn Arabi, and above all, here's another R, with Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi, the 13th century mystic, the 13th century Sufi, who, among other things, and by the way, Rumi is the most read poet in print in the United States today, more so than Shakespeare, more so than Steinway, more so than the Bible. I just want to read you two passages from Rumi's Meisterwerk. One of them reads in part, I go into the Muslim mosque and the Jewish synagogue and the Christian church, and I see one altar. Another one reads, not Christian or Jew or Muslim, not Hindu, Buddhist, Sufi, or Zen, not any religion or cultural system. I am not from the East or the West, not out of the ocean or up from the ground, not natural or ethereal, not composed of elements at all. I do not exist, am not an entity in this world or the next, did not descend from Adam and Eve or any origin story. My place is placeless, a trace of the traceless. I belong to the beloved. One understands that the voice with which the poet speaks, the voice with which the mystic speaks, the voice with which Rumi speaks is the voice of God. Rumi is not presuming or pretending to be God. Rumi is so filled with God that the voice that comes out of him is not his own particularized, intensely Muslim voice. It's an intensely universalist voice that recognizes the infinite array of paths that lead in the same direction toward God. And so it is that Rumi was a particular focus and interest, and he's writing, you understand, in the midst of the Crusades, in the midst of a time when Christians and Muslims are slaughtering each other with great joy and pleasure. It is a time when the Mongols have come into the part of the Middle East where Rumi was originally from and wrought destruction. And his writing is about love. It's not about abandoning his sense of himself as a Muslim. It's seeing himself as a Muslim, small m. And for those of you who don't know Arabic, Muslim means someone who submits to God's will, small m. So anyone who submits to God's will is a Muslim, small m. Capital M, you're speaking about a specific form of faith that begins with Muhammad. Small m, anybody falls into that category, and Rumi is both. And as such, he embraces everyone. He is someone who in particular inspired the individual whom Zeynep referenced in her talk briefly, and that is Fethullah Gulen, a Turkish imam who came at the end of the 20th century, 1999, to the United States, where he still dwells in eastern Pennsylvania, who has been inspired by everyone from Socrates to Einstein and puts all of this together in his own unique way. But above all, he's inspired by Rumi, by Rumi's thinking. He's inspired by Rumi's words. He's inspired by the idea of embracing the world, even as one embraces one's own particular form of faith, one's own particular form of whatever aspect of identity identifies one. Because, Gulen reasons, if I claim as a person of faith to love God, how can I do other than to love all of creation, because God created it all? I can't limit my love to just people who look like me, whose skin color is mine, whose nose shape is mine, whose religion is mine, whose nationality is mine. I can't do that and claim to love God, because then I'm lying. I don't. And of course, if I'm not a person of faith, then I have no excuse for thinking across anti-religious lines anyway. So Gulen was inspired and brought from Turkey to America his thinking, and inspired not only by words, not only by thoughts, but towards actions, towards serving others. And this is the term hizmet in Turkish, again, that Zeynep referenced, hizmet meaning service in Turkish. So an entire movement spread through 160 countries, the point and purpose of which is to serve humanity, to wrestle with the problems, as Zeynep said, of ignorance, of poverty, of prejudice, to use our resilient nature as human beings to reconcile with each other where there hasn't been, to restore ourselves and each other where we need restoration. It is about action. It's about serving others altruistically with concern for God and for those we serve, and not for my own self and my own need and my own ego. It is about establishing schools. It is about establishing social programs. It is about providing water for some community somewhere, be it Africa or anywhere else, which is desperate for water. It is about creating the kind of programs that Gunnar reviewed, that just one part of this organization over the last year has produced, and under difficult circumstances, demonstrating its resilience. The hizmet movement is a movement of Turkish origin, but it's so emphatically American. Americans are known for action, and hizmet is all about action. There is an irony, because history loves ironies. The irony is that Turkey itself, as some of you may not be aware, and you need to be aware if you're not, Turkey itself in the last 15 years has emerged out of a steady pattern since the 1920s of trying to establish itself as a republic and as a democracy. It has emerged out of democracy and climbed and crawled and clamored toward dictatorship and an authoritarian regime which resembles nothing like democracy. It's not just anti-democratic. The particular focus of the current Turkish leaders' animosity is the hizmet movement, is Fethullah Gulen, who has inspired this sense of broad universal generosity of spirit. It's a little bit like, you see, history likes to repeat itself. It's like Germany in the 1930s and Hitler's animosity that was so singular towards the Jews. It's not that there weren't others he also disliked, but particularly and systematically the Jews, so Erdogan and Gulen and hizmet. In fact, you may be aware of these little historical data. Toward the beginning of Hitler's regime, his people set fire to the Reichstag, this very important political building in Berlin, so he could accuse his political enemies of having done so and give him the excuse for rounding them up. And what do you suppose happened in July of 2016? 5 years ago, almost. There was what has been reported repeatedly as a failed coup. It was not. It was a fake coup. It was a coup that was attempted not as a coup, but organized by the current regime's leadership in order to provide the excuse to blame it on the hizmet movement and claim that they had been trying to destabilize a government about which they had absolutely no interest in destabilizing. And the reason I'm bothering you with these details is I talked about the anniversary 3 days ago of that ship coming from Germany, and we turned away those refugees back in 1939, back on January 17th. And if we turn our back on what is happening elsewhere in the world today, we find ourselves in danger of failing to be resilient, failing to be reconciled, failing to restore. And we need to restore, to reconcile, to be resilient. The story of Turkey and its relationship to hizmet is a cautionary tale. We had a crisis not so long ago in this country, culminating on January 6th with an assault, not on the Reichstag and not on a bridge in the middle of Istanbul, but on the Capitol building of the United States at the moment when a transition of government was about to take place from one president to the next, from one party to the next. We barely and have not yet necessarily fully escaped the danger to our democracy, we can and we must maintain and expand our own democracy, our own resiliency, to seek reconciliation between political perspectives, to embrace not other diverse religions, races, refugees, all of which are part and parcel of what have made America at its best be its best. And that's what we have to do to be our best, to come full circle to where I began. If we want to move forward, if we want to move forward on all of these fronts, and not just dealing with COVID, because that's the tip of the iceberg of ways in which we need to move forward, then we need to be resilient, and we need to reconcile one to another. We need to restore ourselves. We need to think of Rumi's words as it applies in his mind to diverse religious traditions, and understand that it applies to diverse ethnic traditions, racial traditions, national traditions, if we Americans are truly to be fully human and fully American at its best. Thank you very much.